There's nothing wrong with a single bevel head. There's just no benefit to it over a double bevel edge. Bow company A, B, C, D, and E can compare themselves to each other is speed. It's their, the feet per second is their 0 to 60 as it relates to the car industry. It's almost impossible to listen to somebody else and become a great bow hunter. You got to get out there and skin your knees yourself.
What is up, everybody? Mark on the mic here. I have Mr. Bryan Broderick across from me virtually through this incredible thing of modern technology. Today, we're going to try to talk about, I don't know if it's possible to talk about, Bryan, but everything arrows. And I think we're going to dive into my personal quest for the perfect arrow, another thing that I'm not sure exists. Maybe that's a unicorn, because I can tell you I've got a rack full of arrows at my house from years gone by where I think I've found the perfect arrow, and then the next year I change it and try and do something different. So I haven't gotten there yet, but before we get too deep into about me, Bryan, let's talk about you. Let's talk about day 6, what you have going on there, and a little bit of backstory before we start, chatting about all the cool things that make up these arrows that we try to shoot at critters.
Sounds good. You want a kind of a brief history of day 6?
Yeah, that'd be perfect, man. Yeah.
Yeah. So day 6, its genesis was actually in Australia. A friend of mine is a buffalo outfitter over there on the Coburg Peninsula for bantang and buffalo, and then the big hogs, stuff like that. And, he stayed very frustrated with his archery setup as well as his clients trying to get through big animals like that. And so he wanted to design a 4mm micro diameter shaft, but with heavy grains per inch, thick wall construction, and just bomb proof, and wanted to have like an integrated component system for it. So that's what he did. And he started that in 2014. And he and I were good friends at the time. And he said, man, I really want you to try these things. And I did, and loved the shafts, but in all honesty, and he and I are good friends. I mean, I could say this, the components were kind of rubbish. So I designed like my own components for it and had them made. And then when he came over in the States and hunted with me, he was like, golly, mate, your stuff's like way better than what we've got.
Oh man, these are good.
Yeah. He's like, oh, yeah, that's a lot better than the one I had. So he said, let's try to partner up and do this. And you handle the States, I'll handle Australia. So we did. And I got to work designing what we have now. It's the centric system components that go on those shafts. And, right when we were getting ready to go with it, he just kind of had a change of heart and wanted to go a different direction, wanted to get deeper into his outfitting. Just kind of said, man, I'm just going to let you take this thing. And so I bought it, bought that from him and formed day 6. And that's kind of the origin of it. And then as we progressed, a couple of years later, we introduced our Broadheads, which were actually Broadheads that I was kind of, backyard garage hybridizing, making myself for years. And so we just, decided to make refined versions of them with the highest quality materials and things like that. And so that's what we, started with, and it was supposed to be kind of a side deal, just kind of a hobby business my wife and I could do. And it just kind of took our lives over. And so here we are 6 years later, and we're full tilt,
Day 6 years later. I have my personal hypothesis of where the name comes from, but what's the thought behind the name Day 6?
I'm curious to hear what your hypothesis is.
Okay, here's how I would personally, like, if I was going to try and break it down on a big game hunt, like 5 days. When you get to day 5, like, I'm pretty beat up. I'm tired, And day 6 is like when you got to kick it into that extra gear, dig deep, mentally and physically, and it's just like that turning point of I don't know. I just feel like that's that point in the hunt where you just got to dig deep.
No. But that's better than the one I had. So no, I'm just kidding. No, day 6 is actually the 6th day of creation.
Okay.
And that's when God created the animals of the earth and the men to rule over them.
Fair enough.
The game we pursue was created on the 6th day. So that's where it came from.
Samsonite. I was way off.
Yeah, I know it. It was a good story though. We might tell that story to all the non-believer customers we have, and we'll use the iris for the believers. So how about that?
There you go. Yeah.
We'll credit you on the second story.
Sounds good. Sounds good. What so you talked a little bit about the arrows, but like what is would you say like your overall arrow philosophy is? Like what are you looking for, an arrow to do?
Well, first off, I'm a firm believer in 2 holes. That is paramount to me. I feel like regardless of where you hit, what you hit, 2 holes are always better than 1. If you have an unobstructed exit hole, you've got a great drain hole, and you've got a great way to get blood loss on the ground and recover that animal. But in order for an arrow to do that, it is 90% arrow flight, and it's 10% all the rest of the crap that all the goobers on the internet argue over. So everybody hyper focuses on the 10% and sometimes overlooks the 90%, which is arrow flight. In order to get perfect arrow flight, though, you have to have a perfectly tuned bow, and that bow has to be perfectly tuned with the arrow. By that, you need the proper spine, and you need consistent spine. So if you have a 300 spine arrow and you have a dozen arrows, they all need to be 300 spine arrow. Industry standard is not very stringent on that. So you might have 25 thousandths of deflection variance over a dozen arrows. So it may go from, 310 to 290 or worse in some cases. And so that means that the arrow is flexing differently every time the bow goes off. So proper spine to me is the most important thing ever. People hyper focus on the straightness. Honestly, humans can't shoot good enough to discern the difference between a 1 thou and a 3 thou straightness arrow. I'll just go ahead and put that out there. And then they focus a lot on the weight tolerance between a dozen arrows. To put it in perspective, if you've listened to anything Levi Morgan's ever talked about, he gets his competition arrows within 6 grains of each other. So, and he's shooting dimes at unknown distances. So, weight is not that important. It is 100% spine and spine consistency, and making sure you have the proper spine to match, what your bow is delivering, because your bow is the engine. It's delivering a pretty consistent amount of force or energy to that arrow every time, and you want that arrow to react the same every time. So that kind of breaks it down in a nutshell as like a 30,000 foot view.
Yeah.
And then the other thing you want is for an arrow to get 2 holes, it needs to have very little resistance. And to put it in perspective, what makes an arrow broadhead combination penetrate properly is arrow flight, which means the nock of the arrow is directly behind the head, and it's focusing all that energy into one very small point. But it also is greatly affected by the friction of the broadhead arrow, all the components. And so the function by which an arrow gets slowed down as it's going through a target, an animal, what have you, is sidewall friction. And if you want to get real nerdy for a second, which it seems like most people respond better to the geeky data science stuff than the kind of the empirical evidence from the field. If you've ever seen like a pier or a walkway or a house supported by a piling that's on poles or a piling, most people think that what supports that structure that's supported by a piling is the blunt end of that piling and how it gets driven down into the ground, and it eventually gets to a point that has enough compaction that that blunt end of that pole sits on that flat surface, and that's what holds it up. In actuality, what it is the density of the soil is measured so it can tell you how big of a piling you want in diameter and how much surface area you need, which is the depth that goes down based on that diameter, for that soil to create sidewall friction, which grips the side surfaces of that pole. And that's what holds the structure up. So it's the exact same science there when it comes to how an arrow goes through. So it's sidewall friction. So you want the least amount of resistance with your arrow, your broadhead, that whole combination. So common sense tells you a smaller diameter arrow has less surface area, less sidewall friction, right? A broadhead that has a very sleek design with very low drag, low surface area, small ferrules, all of that, low sidewall friction. What we do to maximize that, or maybe enhance the performance of the small diameter arrow, is we use a component that has a collar. And so that collar is the diameter of, say, a 308. It's 308 thousandths of an inch in diameter, which is what the standard diameter of a field point, broadhead, all that is. But the beauty of that is that at the very point of the arrow, when you've got that larger diameter, once you get behind the collar and the point of impact, everything behind it now is smaller.
Okay.
So you're poking a 308 hole, and then you're passing a 245 or 250 arrow through it. So you're reducing the sidewall friction by having the leading edge slightly larger than everything behind it. So that is kind of the concept of maximizing the design to get the least amount of sidewall friction to get penetration. So I know that was very deep in the weeds, but no, you asked for it.
No, that was perfect, man. And sometimes I'll bow hunt for a while, and then I'll grab a 308. And that works really well also. Right.
That's right. That's right.
That's
cheater bar.
That's my main tactic. Right. Very cool. You're talking about arrow spine. How does a person, pick the right spined arrow for them, their draw length, draw weight,
Sure.
what they intend to send down range?
Yeah, so that's a great question. So it would be impossible really for most archers to understand the science behind it and determine what they need. So, that's when you reach out to people that do it for a living to kind of help guide you. Unfortunately, what I found is when you go into a lot of the brick and mortar shops, you see a very limited range of spine. I've been into a few shops where they only have 400 spine arrows, regardless of what poundage people shoot. And they say, well, we can just tune your bow to it. And that's not how it works. So there's a lot of companies now that have really good arrow calculators on their sites like we do. You can just plug in your specs and it spits out what you want, what you need. And you can change the variables, change your point weights and all that good stuff. But forever, every arrow company has had a spine chart, and it's super easy to read. Draw length, draw weight, point weight. Here's what you need. Those things are accurate. They're not wrong. And they should be followed regardless of what someone else is telling you. You hear the bro science a lot to where, man, that's all I ever shoot's a 400 spine arrow and I can make it fly out of my 75-pound bow. That's not how it works. So plenty of resources out there to find proper spine. It's not hard anymore like it used to be.
Gotcha. What, you hear a lot of things these days about, FOC, front of center, arrow weight, things like that. Do you have a general target that you feel just optimizes, and then I should say, at least the context that I know I'm thinking about these things is like an optimal hunting arrow. Like everything I do, and I think maybe just the shape of this conversation can be around that, but like everything that I do, like archery wise, like whether it's my practice or what I'm doing, the end goal is I'm going to hunt with this setup, right?
Right.
What are you looking for there as far as like, grains per inch, overall arrow weight, FOC, are we is too much emphasis being put on some of these factors, not enough?
Yes.
Where are you out there?
Yes. So again, that goes back to most people are focusing on the micro and ignoring the macro. They're focusing on the 10% instead of the 90. FOC being one of them. FOC is a real thing. And it certainly could be a real factor if, this is a huge if we could build arrows that were 50, 60, 70, 80% FOC, like a dart on a dartboard, okay?
Mm-hmm.
And you eliminate the distribution of mass front to back and you stack it all in the front, 80, 90% like a dart, you could have a very, very efficient arrow that is not going to be susceptible to a lot of outside factors. And the arrow flight would not be as critical. But in the real world, those percentages of FOC are not, they're not obtainable. It's impossible to build one. I mean, you really, really, really have to push the limits to build a 30% FOC arrow. I mean, it's almost impossible. So here's what I would say, and this is probably controversial, but with a human shooter, or even out of like a Hooter shooter, as far as penetration goes, you're not going to be able to measure the difference in FOC from 10% to 25 or 30%. It's just not measurable in those small increments, okay? If we could build those high FOC arrows like 70, 80, 90%, it's a measurable difference, okay? But we're splitting hairs on something that just doesn't matter. Overall arrow weight, that's a great question because the archery industry tends to, as a whole, tends to focus on speed. The reason is that the bow manufacturers are kind of the mothership, and then everything trickles down from that, right? So the only way that bow company A, B, C, D, and E can compare themselves to each other is speed. It's their, the feet per second is their 0 to 60 as it relates to the car industry. So that's really the only measurable, if you will. And so that's why you see it on the forefront of all their advertising marketing. So as you have this trickle down effect of all the supporting casts in the archery industry, they're conscious of that, and they're building products, to cater to that speed calculation as the marketing tool. But if you took these modern bows and analyzed them, and by the way, most of them are designed and tested around 30 inches of draw, which is not what most normal humans have. We're normally in that 27, 28, 29 range. As you are dropping down in draw length, you're dropping down in the power stroke of the bow, and you're losing performance. Everybody knows that. The guys with the 26, 27 inch draws, they basically have to shoot 10 pounds more to have the same speed with a commensurate weight arrow as a guy with a 30 inch draw. So with all that said, these bows really are, they achieve their max efficiency at about 8 grains per pound. Okay. So let's say you have a 30 inch draw, 30 inch draw length, 70 pound draw weight. That arrow would be perfectly matched to the bow and have the max efficiency if it was 560 grains, which is 8 grains times 70 for a 30 inch draw guy. Okay. So with that being said, the way to explain that in layman's terms is, let's say that you shoot a 560 grain arrow out of that 70-pound bow to 30-inch draw, when you shoot the bow, all 70 pounds are going into the arrow. Okay. If you shot a 400 grain arrow, which is substantially less, say 30, 40% less in weight, what you're doing now is you're putting 50 pounds into the arrow, but 20 pounds, the arrow's too light to absorb all 70 pounds. It can't take all the horsepower. So it's putting 20 pounds back into the bow in the form of vibration and noise. So the bow is essentially a modified dry fire with a light arrow, and it's not utilizing all the energy. And to prove that point, to make it super simple to understand, if you're shooting a 450 grain arrow out of that same bow, let's say you're shooting 300 feet per second, okay? And then you go to a 560 grain arrow. Well, you're going to drop, say, to 260, right? But that's only, 10 or 12% drop in speed versus a 30 to 40% increase in mass. So if you increased your mass of your arrow that much, if the bow was already operating at max efficiency, it would drop the velocity commensurate with the weight increase. Does that make sense?
Yeah.
But you're not. You only drop a little bit. It's because you were never getting all the energy into the arrow anyway because it was too light. Is that tracking?
Mm-hmm. So what's interesting there is like in my mind also, I'm like, well, you're gaining this velocity. So then like, is that, you talk like, bullets or whatever, people are like, oh, speed kills. Like, it seems like it's interesting to me that you're losing that efficiency, but you're also gaining velocity on the back end still.
Well, you're actually gaining velocity on the front end. So the other thing to address there is shed velocity. Okay. So the rate that the arrow or the projectile sheds velocity.
Okay.
So, all right. So what you're going to have is a 450 grain arrow that's going to be 300 out of the bow versus a 560 that's going to be 260 out of the bow. But by the time you get to 50 yards, they're going the same speed.
Oh.
So here's the analogy for that. A golf ball and a ping pong ball are the same shape and size, right?
Mm-hmm.
The only difference is the weight. So you can throw both of them with the same arm speed, and you can throw a ping pong ball about 20 feet and it falls to the ground. And you can throw a golf ball out of sight.
Right.
Because the lighter projectile sheds velocity and drops to the ground.
It makes perfect sense.
Yeah. And anybody that shoots like long range rifle stuff, they know that there's a happy medium there. You don't want a super lightweight bullet, but you don't want a super heavy bullet. And you're trying to find that perfect blend of weight that can absorb and travel the best trajectory with the fixed amount of horsepower that is your charge from your cartridge, right?
Mm-hmm.
Same thing with a bow. The bow is a fixed engine. It's a fixed amount of horsepower that's going to be, that energy is fixed. That's your constant. Your mass is what you adjust to change your trajectory. So back to your original question, super heavy arrows, it goes past the point of diminishing return. It overloads the bow and you start losing efficiency. And then super, super light arrows, you start losing efficiency. Now, let me say this. This is what I want to preface all of this discussion with. What you see in the hunting industry is, for the most part, you see a lot of the very best shooters and archers in the game that promote or represent company A, B, or C, or X, Y, or Z. And the problem is that what you see these incredible archers, athletes that are just at the top of their game, what you see their capabilities allowing them to do with certain setups is not relatable or translatable to the 99% of the rest of us normal humans. So if you're trying to set up bows like some of these elite guys do that can shoot an ultralight arrow at incredibly long distances, we can't do it. We don't have the skill set. there's a reason there's only half of 1% of them that do what they do. And that's kind of the problem with the way the hunting industry is set up for archers, is that you're looking at guys that can do things that the most of us can't. So when you're setting up an arrow for us normal humans, you need to find something in the middle of the road. You need that happy medium. Number one, the heavier arrow is going to do two things. It's going to slow down the arrow, which is going to be more forgiving for a guy trying to shoot a broadhead and be more accurate. And it's also going to be more mass, which is going to help push that arrow through. So you don't want to be too light. You don't want to be too heavy. And it all is situational on whether the guy has a 26-inch draw and shooting 60 pounds or a 31-inch draw and shooting 80. It's not a one size fits all. With the guys that have shorter draws and shorter draw lengths, even female shooters, youth shooters of that nature, I always steer to a way heavier arrow because they don't have the luxury or benefit of the velocity side that other guys have. So the only way to get their momentum calculation up is raise the mass. But most people go the other way. They go with a lighter arrow and try to achieve the same speed that, say, dad's shooting. And that's not how you're going to make an efficient setup for hunting. Now, if you're just shooting 3D tournaments, great, doesn't matter. But as it pertains to hunting, which is the only thing day 6 is focused on, you have to basically figure out what's going to be the best setup to get 2 holes and at what effective range. So for short draw guys, low poundage, youth shooters, females, there needs to be a self-imposed range limit. You need to set up a heavier, slower arrow, but max yourself out at 30 yards. And then, you can't shoot the same range and distances and be as effective as your dad or whoever that has, a longer draw and heavier poundage. So that's kind of how we look at setting up arrows for people, is on an individual basis based on what's going to get them 2 holes. That's the only thing we're focused on. We don't build target arrows. We only build hunting arrows. So I don't think we ever will, because it's just not what we do. And our broadheads are the same way. We're building heads for just optimum hunting and the least amount of resistance to get 2 holes. So I hope that kind of answered your question.
No, it did. It did. Yeah, perfectly. What about like arrow length? Like I know throughout the last few years, we'll say, or whatever, like my draw length hasn't changed, but depending, it's like, this arrow's got a little bit heavier spine. This one's got a little bit lighter spine. My arrows are changing a little bit there. Is there anything, how are you gauging that for the individual shooter and making sure that they've got the proper arrow length? Is that just simply based on draw length, or how's that working?
No, that's another really good question. So historically, when you would walk into an archery shop, and to get more arrows, the first thing I would ask you is what's your arrow length? How long is your arrow? I worked in an archery shop in the 80s and early 90s, and same thing, how long is your arrow? But so it was always kind of the first thing determined. As we developed over the years and understood more about what's called dynamic spine, which is how that arrow flexes based on its cut length, point weight, and how much energy is being delivered to it from the bow, you understand that arrow length should probably be the last thing you determine instead of the first. And the reason is let's say that you come to me and say 27-inch draw, 65 pounds, and I shoot a 100-grain broadhead. So I can very easily determine what spine you need and what length, okay? And we try to keep the length close or commensurate to what the draw length is, to not have an arrow too terribly long. And so you consider that factor, and you consider what the point weight is to be, to determine the spine and length. But let's say, for instance, that you come to me and say, same specs, but man, last year I bought, a tractor trailer load of 200-grain broadheads because Ranch Fairy said to. And so we now know, okay, you've got all these heads and you don't want to buy any more. So we have to beef up the spine and change the length to adjust for that point weight. And we do that daily. I mean, absolutely daily. We do that. And so, it's the factors of point weight are going to affect what that length is. And then the other factor is if, let's say that you come to me and say, man, I want to shoot a 600 grain arrow. How do I get there? So what we have to do is we may have to go up in spine that you would normally shoot. Let's say you should probably be in a 350 with a normal size broadhead. But for us to get you to 600, we're going to have to beef it up to say a 300 or a 250, and then add 150 grain weight and some extra component weight to get you there. And then the other thing we have to do is adjust that length based on how much point weight for that spine. So the way we tune a bow is we start with bare shafts, and we basically, if you have a fixed point weight that you don't want to change, we'll set that up and we'll actually cut that bare shaft from the nock end. We'll pull the nock and continue to trim it. So if the arrow's too long, it's going to show that it's weak because it's flexing too much. And we can pull the nock and just keep trimming from the nock end and shortening the arrow. And as you shorten it, you're changing the dynamic spine and making it stiffer, of course. And that's the way we tune. And then once you do that, and then you take that tuned bare shaft where it's flying true, and then you build a fletched arrow of the same length, weight, everything, and you shoot those together. That is how you broadhead tune. You actually don't tune with broadheads. If you will tune with bare shafts and a fletched arrow, that bare shaft is going to tell you how your center shot is off now and how to adjust your rest left and right so you have perfectly true center shot. So once you have those two hitting together, as long as your broadhead is the same weight, you can put multiple different broadheads on the front and shoot them. And that's where the breakdown usually is. And that's where most people end up just going the easy route and just getting expandables because they fly just like their field points and they won't accentuate any flaws in their arrow flight.
For sure. Yeah. I mean, and I've done that, right?
Most people do.
So yeah, that is super interesting. I didn't think about it that way. And I mean, yeah, that's also a lot of work, right? I mean, you're doing a lot of work doing that bare shaft tuning. That's going to take time. At what distance do you like to like bare shaft tune to where you think, yep, like I can? Because I've seen guys, paper tune, but it's like at 5 yards, and I'm like, well, I don't know, like, is that a good distance, or like what's the best distance to do that at?
So paper tuning is the equivalent of bore sighting your rifle.
Yeah,
it gets you on paper.
Mm-hmm.
But most people take that as a finished tune. It's literally a snapshot in the paradox of that arrow. So you're going to get different holes, different types of tears at different distances until you're properly tuned. But that is a very quick and easy way to get you out of the shop. So at what distance is another great topic, because that is going to be basically correlated with the skill level of the shooter. Okay. So everybody should start at 20 yards bare shaft tuning and get them to where your fletched arrow with a field point is hitting with your bare shaft with a field point. And there's lots of different instructions and things out there to help you do that. We actually have an instructional blog on our website if you wanted to read over that. But so for myself, like I can shoot consistently bare shafts with fletched arrows out to the 40, maybe 50-yard range, depending on what kind of day I'm having. But there's other shooters like Dakota, that's our GM. I've watched him shoot bare shafts and field points together out to 80 and 100.
Unbelievable.
It's the 1% guys versus the rest of us normal humans. So, but here's the thing. If you have a repeatable shot, and you're applying the proper amount of grip torque to your bow every time, which number one, I'm gonna tell you right now, grip torque is the number one. That is the devil when it comes to properly shooting your bow and having consistent broadhead flight. That's where 90% of the people fail, myself included. So, but if you have a good repeatable shot, you're going to be able to see at what distance you can shoot these bare shafts and field points together with fletched arrows. And that's going to be a great indicator of what your effective range should probably be with your broadheads, because it's going to be indicative of what the repeatable accuracy you can have with broadheads are at what ranges. Because the broadhead's going to react just like the bare shaft does. So, but it's a great way to practice. I shoot bare shafts every shooting session, because what it is it's very unforgiving, and it tells you every time you're screwing something up. So it keeps you really, really honest. And in a previous life, I drove a race car a little bit, and when you would practice, your crew would always get your car way out of shape and make you basically fight the damn thing all the way around the track. So, but if you could figure out how to get smooth and fast with a car that was really set up poorly, when they set it up right, you were incredibly smooth and fast. And the bare shaft is the same thing. The bare shaft is unforgiving. It's loose. It's not going to let you get away with anything. And so it's going to keep you really honest and make you focus on perfect grip torque, applying the same amount of pressure, squeezing through your shot, not torquing your string, so on and so forth. So it keeps you really honest. The other thing it does, Mark, is it is a baseline for your bow tune. So let's say that your bow, your strings and harnesses are stretching and your timing's getting off. You now have a way to check it. So if your bare shaft starts hitting high and low of your fletched arrow consistently, now that you've got a timing issue, and you've had, your string and harnesses stretched and things have gotten out. So it's a great way to basically check your sight or check your tune every time you practice. I feel like everybody should shoot one at every practice session. So that's another great benefit of it.
Yeah, I mean, and you touched on it, but that was my first thought when I'm like, man, that's going to be really unforgiving. Like, you better have your stuff together. And then I'm like,
that's right.
Then I'm like, oh man, can I shoot good enough to even get any relevant information, out of that? That's actually something I've never done. Like, I've never, I go to the archery shop, or, I mean, heck, back in the day, I'd get my arrows. They're pre-fletched, I think the inserts were in, it said, look at the side to say poundage 60 to 70. Oh, that's cool. I fall in that bracket. Let's go,
Right.
And now it's like, I feel like I've evolved to, I guess a point where I'm putting more thought into it. And then, I mean, that's a whole nother level right there for sure.
Well, our buddy Brad at Argali, he shoots his bow a lot, and he's a very detailed oriented person. And so we talk a lot about bow setup and things of that nature, and he's really a good shot. And I've, worked through things with him where he's got his bow perfectly tuned. He's shooting great. And then I'll get a call from him one day and go, man, something's off. It's hitting here, it's hitting there. I can't figure out what it is. And I'll tell him the same thing. I'll say, put your bow down, go hang it up in the garage, start again tomorrow. Because what it is, he's just having a day. Everybody has them, and he's not just making a perfectly consistent shot. And sure enough, he'll call back the next day and go, yep, it's dialed. And it may be something as simple as just applying a different amount of pressure or a different pressure point on your hand one day that you just didn't do before. And it's making it playing left or right or up or down. So what I see a lot of people do is they have their wrenches out and they tweak and tune and move stuff on their bow every time they shoot it. And that is not the way. That is not the way.
No, I learned long ago, I guess, one of my rules of thumb, the deeper I get into a shooting session, the less likely I will make any sort of change based off based off the data that I'm getting at the time. I might note it. I might note like, oh, well, I feel like it's doing this, but I'm going to go back, like you said, I'm going to go back tomorrow and shoot again. And usually I find that I'm glad I didn't make that adjustment.
Well, and another good thing that people can do is intentionally introduce error. And that kind of goes back to the racing analogy that I mentioned, where you're intentionally setting up the car wrong. And by intentionally introducing error, you learn what the bow does and how it reacts to improper, say, grip torque. Okay. So, and I say torque grip a lot backwards. So forgive me, it's grip torque, but it's one of those glitches. But anyway, when you're shooting your bow, if you'll draw back and shoot a group and intentionally torque your bow and point your stabilizer to the right, say 15 degrees, and try to point your stabilizer, say to the same fence post every time, and try to make that consistent and shoot a group, and you'll see how that arrow reacts to right grip torque. Okay. And then do the same thing, shoot a group and torque your bow and point your stabilizer to a fence post to the left and try to hold it in the same position every time. What it's going to do, it's going to tell you, it's going to show you exactly how that arrow reacts when it has improper grip torque, left or right. So when you're out practicing and shooting groups and all of a sudden your arrows are planing left or whatever, you're like, oh, I know what I'm doing. I've seen this before. And I never hear anybody tells people to do it wrong to show you what the result is. So how do you know to fix it if you don't know what the result of it is? So that's super important, and so beneficial for the people we've helped over the years.
Yeah, that makes a lot of sense. Not something that I would have thought about, but yeah, I mean, it's almost like you're building in those data points of indicators. So then when you are trying to shoot properly, but you're not getting, I guess we'll say, the proper result, you can ferret out what you think might be going on there with your grip. And boy, it is crazy how much that does make a difference, and then also, having that be ingrained in your shot process, which is something that I'm working on. It's a lot easier to do in the backyard. It's more difficult, at least for me. I'm in the stand. I'm cold. Maybe I'm a little twisted up because a buck's coming in a way that I didn't anticipate, but it's still within range and things are happening. Or you got a bull that's coming in doing, whatever, what have you.
Sure.
And sometimes you're just not in the perfect shooting position either,
Well, there's a great point right there. So there's one thing to set your bow up for shooting at the archery range or shooting on a flat surface in your yard, but that never translates into the field. And so let's say that, yeah, you can shoot a super light arrow super fast and you can be deadly accurate with it at the range. But when you get into a hunting situation where you have your one foot higher than the other because you're on a side hill, or you're in a tree stand having to twist around behind a tree to shoot, that's where that super fast, very unforgiving setup is going to tell on you and cheat on you, and cause some heartache. So that's why a heavier, slower arrow is more forgiving in hunting situations. Here's another just sidebar. If you have, in my mind, if you have a 28-inch or longer draw, you should never own a bow less than 30 inches axle to axle. I like long axle to axle bows. So to prove the point, go to the professional shoots, and those guys are shooting 36, 37, 38, 40-inch long bows. It's reducing the knock pinch and the angle of the string, and it is very forgiving and very consistent. And people say, well, I like a shorter bow for tree stands. That's horse crap, because the difference between a 27-inch bow and a 33-inch bow is 6 inches, but it's only 3 inches on one end. So if that 3 inches is going to make a difference in a tree stand, you're doing something wrong. It's not a, I don't know how this whole thing got started about being better for tree stands and shorter. The shorter the bow, the less forgiving it is, the harder it's going to be accurate, and it's going to torture you constantly. Go longer. You almost can't go long enough. And so everybody says, well, the shorter bows are faster. They are, but it's 1 or 2 feet per second. That's not measurable. So just so people know, like when you shoot your bow 3 times, the odds of you getting the same speed 3 times in a row are slim to none. Compound bows are not repeatable within 1 foot per second shot to shot. That's a fact. So there's no reason to worry about 1 or 2 feet per second in speed or velocity or whatever. It's not going to make enough of a difference. What's going to make more of a difference is having that longer axle to axle bow, less string pinch, less knock pinch, and a slighter string angle for hunting situations. The other thing is, I know I harp on this a lot about the grip torque, but I used to always try to practice and shoot my bow with like a very low contact, open hand style, minimal contact grip hand, and be extremely accurate that way. The problem with that is that you are not going to be able to do that in a lot of situations in the field. A lot of times these shots happen incredibly fast, and you just don't have time to go through that sequence. So over the last 10 or 15 years, I have kind of changed back to a more engaged grip hand where I have more of my hand on the bow, and I learn how to apply proper pressure with more hand on it, fingers engaged, to where it's going to be more commensurate with what my situation will be hunting, taking a shot on an animal. Especially if you're shooting downhill, uphill, whatever, you're not going to be able to have that perfect open tournament style grip hand. So I think that's important too.
Yeah, and that's a little bit of what I was even getting at earlier. You know, like I had, and it's interesting to hear you say that, and I might try what you're saying because I've actually been working on my bow grip and you know, having that, like you said, that less engaged, you know, more open grip. I had one opportunity at a deer this year. I'm going to venture to guess that my grip was not the same one that I had been practicing with.
It never is. Never seems to be anyway.
No, that's and that makes a lot of sense. You know, I mean, there's, you know, you hear like that old saying, like, you know, practice how you play, right? You know,
that's right.
And if you are able to do that, great. You know what I mean? So, but just, you know, make, again, like you said, that consistency and is incredibly important to be able to maintain. What about, you know, like component materials? You were talking a little bit about your centric system. Maybe talk a little bit how that might differ perhaps from some others, or the why behind it. And then, you know, it's like aluminum, titanium, stainless steel. I think you guys might have some of that.
We do. Yeah.
You know, like I guess the pros and cons to each, or the why behind you might want to go with A over B.
Sure. So yeah, we probably get more questions about the components than anything else. So that's probably a great thing to discuss. So one of the things that we wanted to do when we started day 6 was have a complete package. We wanted to have what we deemed as the perfect arrow shaft, as the way we constructed it, combined with the perfect component system at the end. Because historically, you would buy a dozen shafts or whatever, and it would come with this very cheap, 10-cent aluminum insert that you just glue in. And there was not really any thought into that. So with that being said, what happened is the market kind of evolved where people were like, okay, I want to have a little beefier component on the end that has an external collar that protects the end of the shaft from mushrooming. And because that's what it's there for. And so, like, we used to glue aluminum arrows, cut pieces of aluminum over carbon arrows at the end. And we would just do that. It's called a footing, and it would just keep it from mushrooming. And that was we were traditional hunters. We shot a lot of stick bows, and you're, shooting stumps, and you're missing a lot. So, you want to protect that arrow. So that's kind of where all that came along. What we wanted to do is have it to where it was all in one place, because people were buying, say, a dozen arrows from here, throwing away the cheap 10-cent insert, and then going to a third party and buying external components to match with those. So by the time you did it, you had a lot of money tied up in these two things, and they were coming from two different sources. And they weren't necessarily designed perfectly to fit that particular shaft. It was designed with enough tolerance to fit over like 4 different shafts. There you go. So anyway, what we wanted to do is have it all in one place, a complete system. The other thing that we wanted is we wanted to have our shaft strong enough and our components strong enough that when they bonded together, the sum of all parts created a very monolithic, durable arrow end. And what you'll get when you buy like aftermarket components and put them on, say, shaft X, Y, or Z, those shafts are traditionally built with as least amount of material as possible to make them affordable, because carbon's expensive. And so they're very light, very brittle. When you add a very durable component to it, the only thing you're doing is moving the hinge point or the weak point of that arrow back, whatever the length of that component is. So you can put a super durable component on the end of a traditionally built arrow, but once you get to the back of it, you go right back to that weak arrow, and now you've created a hinge point of super strong and super weak, and it's going to break right there every time. And that's what a lot of people experience. And the other thing is that we wanted to be able to index everything on the inside of the shaft. So the way the arrow, if you can imagine how an arrow is made, imagine a roll of paper towels, and the paper towels are wrapped around the cardboard tube. So when you get down to the cardboard tube, it's very uniform and perfect. But as you add layers of paper towels around it, it becomes less and less uniform. And by the time you get done, it's not round. So if you're orienting your heads off of a collar or something that glues to the outside of the shaft and not the inside, you're now orienting your point on the part that's not true on an arrow. You want to index everything on the inside of the arrow, which is perfect. Okay. So the inside of the tube is perfect. So what we wanted to do is we wanted to be able to have something that had the insert part, but also the collar for durability part bonded together as one piece, but it's still indexed on the inside and floated around the outside. And then you fill that gap with epoxy. And so it will fill in all the irregularities on the outside of that diameter of that shaft. And now you've got a one-piece unit, but it still is indexing on the perfectly straight part. Kind of sounds complicated, but it's actually really simple stuff.
I mean, it does make sense the way you're explaining it, though. It's like, yeah, why wouldn't you, go off essentially the truest part?
That's right. Yeah, like when you stick a bore sighter in the end of a rifle, you don't put it around the outside of the barrel, you put it in the inside of the barrel.
Right.
Same premise. So with regards to the materials you asked about, aluminum, titanium, stainless, those are kind of the 3 commons that are used. What we use those 3 materials for, believe it or not, is not really structural integrity. It's strictly for weight, because of the weight densities and the weight density properties of the different materials. So we can easily keep the design almost identical, but change the material from aluminum, that's 50, and then make it out of titanium, and it's 75. Then you make it out of stainless, and it's 100. Does that make sense?
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
So we're doing it for the weight, for the guys that want to change the weights on the front. So,
and is that like just kind of customizing that weight on the front to ultimately affect the dynamic spine of the arrow to match what you want it to be doing?
That's exactly right.
Okay.
That's exactly right. So Where we see a lot of guys using the heavier weight components or the trad guys because they'll typically shoot more point weight. Um, so with our shafts, when you look at our shaft, the walls on our shafts, they're pretty much twice as thick as anything else you'll look at. We do our arrows a little differently, and our shafts are almost bomb proof basically because there's so much material in them. When you combine the aluminum component where it bonds perfectly within a thousandth of an inch to the inside of the shaft and the outside of the shaft, and it all bonds together, it's the sum of all parts. It's using the strength of that very strong carbon arrow shaft that's actually stronger than the aluminum. Is combining all three, inside, outside, and then the inside carbon shaft into one, and it's utilizing each other's strength properties to create its structural integrity at the end. When you change to titanium, titanium is stronger, but with our system, it doesn't really matter because the shafts are so strong that you're already at overkill. And then once you go to hardened stainless, it's just overkill. So we have a lot of guys say, I really want to use titanium or stainless because I want it to be more durable. And we try to tell them, hey, with our stuff, it doesn't really matter. It's really there for weight, but you can do what you want to do. It's just overkill past that point. Now, it does matter when you get into like cheaper, thinner wall shafts because you actually need those components to beef up the end. The structural properties matter. But again, like I mentioned earlier, it's only going to be as strong as where the footprint of that component is, because once you get behind it, you just go right back to a brittle shaft.
Gotcha. Yeah, once again, Bryan, you're making sense. You're making sense. I appreciate it, man.
Yeah, no problem.
Another thing I think about is Vane style, and I mean, you see, I think of like the first arrows that I shot. Man, I thought I was pretty high speed. I was shooting camouflage aluminum arrows and probably had, I don't even know what they were, man, 6-inch, vanes on them. Just these.
They were probably fives.
Yeah.
Yep.
Just like it's so funny. I can go into the basement and see my personal arrow evolution over time. Right.
Me too.
And it's like, I shot 3 vanes forever. I went to 4 this year, but like, what do you think is kind of ideal, for a hunting arrow as far as vane style, size, helical, rigidness? Sure. You hear some guys say like, oh, this vane is, louder than this one, so I choose this one over that one. I'm kind of wrapping probably too many questions into one. One of my questions is like how relevant is that? In my mind, I'm like, to me, it's like the sound of the bow going off is going to outweigh, the sound of any vane noise as the arrow heads towards the arrow. But let's start with like, what are you looking for in a vane and vane setup?
Well, so believe it or not, the vanes are a pretty critical component. And what we did when we first started is I bought everything out there, everything that was available, and we tested everything. We listen. I know you guys make and build products too, but I think everybody knows that every single product that comes out takes a year of testing, because every launch starts with after a year of rigorous testing. So that's how long it takes, right? That's kind of, it's kind of BS in a lot of ways. But anyway, we actually did test this. And what we did was very rudimentary, but very simple ways of doing it. We put on all the vanes, we shot them at distances, and basically just put a decibel meter down, and we measured the sound as the arrow was passing. Three fletch, 4 fletch, etc. Different types of vanes. Some of them sounded like bottle rockets coming down range. And anybody that's ever had like a bee buzz at them, when that, you can hear it coming, and when it gets louder, your initial reaction is to duck. Yeah, anything, you can hear things coming at you, and as it gets louder, you know, danger, it's ducking. It's the sound of a bomb coming in on a movie, right? So we felt like, and I've always felt like that is incredibly important, especially at distance. Um, so, because a lot of times the sound of your bow will be muffled by wind or whatever, any type of, ancillary factors. Uh, and the animals, depending on distance and conditions, may not hear the bow and react to it, but they will react to the sound of the arrow incoming. So we tested everything. The other thing is that I've spent a lifetime doing this in bow hunting, and I learned what I liked and what I didn't like. And there's the makeup of the vane is incredibly important. The material used, how soft it is, how rigid it is, because two things. A softer vane to a certain point is going to be more forgiving when it comes to rest contact, limb contact, shooting through grass, real world stuff. A stiffer vane is going to be less forgiving. It's going to cause the arrow to react more. The other thing is that a lot of really stiff vanes, you shoot them through a target and they crinkle on you, they're never coming back.
Mm-hmm.
To where the material that is a little bit softer has less of a memory, and it'll actually come back to its original shape. But what you can get into is too soft of a vane, and what those things will do is cause drag, and they'll almost like ripple as they're going through the wind. Okay. Yep. So there's a delicate balance there. And then you've got profile, and you see all these new vanes coming out, this profile, that profile, this one's the best, that one's the best. Honestly, you'd want to shoot as little vane as possible and maintain control. And so for me, low profile parabolic vanes are proven to be quieter. They're very forgiving. It's a very simple concept, but dang it, it's been tried for hundreds and hundreds of years. There's no reason to reinvent the wheel. There's some vanes, like say a blazer vane, they're a very high profile, but they're short, but they are incredibly loud. I would just, for me, it's not what I would ever put on there because of the noise that it generates. It's funny. I saw a company last year introduce their own proprietary vane. And basically what they did is they bought an existing vane that's been around for 20 years and then just put their logo on it and said, we tested this after a year of testing. we tested this vane, and it says, that this is the quietest, most stable. Well, it's by far one of the loudest vanes we've ever tested. And anybody that's ever shot it has said the same thing. Like, wait a minute, it's a so-and-so vane. We've shot it for years. It's incredibly loud. So, it's funny how you have to kind of dissect all of this marketing stuff and get through the kind of the marketing veil that's in front of you. So with that said, here's what I feel is important. I feel that a helical is very important because what you're wanting to do is you're wanting to get that arrow rotating as fast as you can and as tight as you can. But the max velocity that arrow rotates is not going to change based on 3 or 4 fletch. It's just going to achieve that max spin rate faster or slower. Okay. So that's not as critical. The reason I shoot 4 fletch and have for 25 years, and a lot of other guys that shoot them have for a long time, is for strictly one reason, and it's a follow-up shot. So with a 4 fletch vane, you do not have to look down at your arrow to load a second arrow. You can keep your eye on your target or the animals and never take your eye off of them. Because let's say that you hit a bull or miss a bull, and as soon as you do and your shot goes off, the whole herd erupts. But a lot of times they're going to run out there and stop if they don't know what it was and look back for 1 second, maybe. If you're shooting 4 fletch, as soon as you shoot, the first thing I do as soon as I shoot is nock another arrow. but I do that never taking my eye off the animal, because I can knock a four fletch up or down and the orientation of the fletchings don't matter. And you can ask Brad about me and knocking a second arrow and then the scolding that happens if you don't. So, because it's super important. And I've had so many instances to where I've knocked that second arrow, gone ahead and drawn, and what I thought my first shot to be a perfect vital shot, say on an elk, and it runs out to say 65 yards and stops and looks back. So two things. I'm already drawn, and I also have shot the same weight arrow at the same speed forever. So I know the trajectory of my arrow, and I don't have to range. I don't have to adjust my sight. I know what my holdovers are for certain pins. And so if you have learned over the years to judge yardage, like I'm old, so we didn't have rangefinders for the majority of my bow hunting career. That was a later thing. You were forced to learn how to judge yardage. So if that elk runs out there at 65 and you go, okay, he's between 60 and 70, you're already drawn. As soon as he stops, you can do a holdover and get a follow-up shot. And any arrow into an animal that's hit is a good arrow, especially on really big game, moose, caribou, elk, so on and so forth. So that's my philosophy anyway. With a four fletch, that aids in making that follow-up shot happen very quickly. Now, in all transparency, what led me to that is shooting a stick bow for 25 years. And in the first, years of shooting a longbow or a recurve, I missed a lot. And you kill a lot of animals with a traditional bow on your second shot because your bows are so quiet when you shoot those stick bows. The animals just don't react and they don't necessarily know what it is. And you get a lot of follow-up shots. And I would venture to say in the first 10 years of shooting a stick bow, I bet you half the animals I killed were on a follow-up shot.
Wow.
After missing the first time. So that's where the four fletch came into play to be very valuable, because I got so used to missing, you'd immediately knock another arrow and you don't have to look at it. So that's why I shoot four fletch. The helical is important because you want to get that spin rate up fast. Vane type is important because, as we mentioned, the materials are going to make it forgiving. The profile is going to make it forgiving. And those are things that people should take into consideration. There's no reason to reinvent the wheel with the Vane. Again, that's people focusing on the 10% and ignoring the 90%. They're focusing on the micro and they hadn't spent enough time on the macro. So build your foundation first and then start tweaking your system. I think that's it on Vanes. But what you didn't ask me about, which I think is important, is the Nock. The Nock is more important than the Vane. You want to shoot the smallest Nock you can to reduce string pinch, Nock pinch, and then you want to make sure that the serving size is the proper size to have just the right amount of grip so the Nock has the right amount of grip and it's not too tight or too loose. That is incredibly important because that is the thing that releases from the bow. And if it's not consistent, you're never going to be accurate and consistent. The other thing is lighted Nocks. Everybody loves them. We don't shoot them because there's a chance of failure. What happens with lighted Nocks is you have the same size Nock that you would have with a traditional Nock, but instead of it being a solid material, it is a very little amount of material encapsulated around an apparatus to light it. And those are not strong. They're not consistent. They're not durable. For me, I've never had one break on a target. They've always broken on an animal. I just have that luck, And so finally, I just said, heck with this. I'll shoot a reflective wrap, but I'm not going to shoot the lighted Nocks anymore because the Nock is so important to accuracy. So not a lot to talk about with a Nock, but incredibly amount of importance to it. I will say this. I don't drop brands a lot. But I will say that out of all the Nocks that we've ever tested and shot and that I've shot, the AAE IP series, the IP4, IP5, the way those are built, their design, the way they have, how they engage the string, they're pretty hard to beat.
Gotcha.
Yeah.
And then the vanes that you guys are running, is that a proprietary vane, or is that?
No. We would never get into making vanes because there's just, again, if there was room for improvement and there was a hole in the market, that's what we're for. We'll fill it. But there was no hole in the market. There's no really room for measurable improvement on vanes. And when I see people get wrapped around the axle on this new vane, it's almost comical because you're hyping up something that you almost can't measure the difference. It's a 1% difference, maybe, not even that. So for us, after we shot everything out there, the Hybrid 2.6 and the Max Stealth, those two were pretty much the same. They're the same profile, same everything, same size. The Max Stealth was a little stiffer and it was slightly quieter, almost not measurable. The only reason we didn't go with that is because while it did test the best by almost, not enough difference to matter, you have to use a primer pin before you adhere them. And what we didn't want to do is sell very expensive arrows. And if a guy had, two that he had to refletch and he wanted to refletch them himself, and he didn't know that they had to be primed, he would have a failure. And so the Hybrid 2.6 is the exact same profile. It's just out of a slightly different material. And you can glue it with anything and glue it on, and they stick fantastic. And I will say this, there's some vanes out there that, kind of the leg humper fanboy crowd has gone crazy over. Heck, we can't get them to stick. I mean, they just almost won't stick. And literally had to develop a system with, acetone prep and certain type of glue to even get them to stick. And I've even had different color vanes stick differently than other color vanes.
I could see that happening
because of the pigment. So what we're trying to do is just make sure we're providing something that's easily serviceable and performs the best for everybody. So, again, there's some really bad ones out there that are super loud, but for the most part, most of the vanes are pretty good, and you're not really going to your outcome by messing around with vanes.
Gotcha. Well, you do make me feel, because of all the vanes that I've tried, and I can see why, just from, like you said, from a service standpoint, but I did like those Max Stealths. I liked the profile. I thought they were, quiet enough for me. I liked that they were a little bit more flexible. I've shot a lot more rigid vanes as well.
Yep.
And I preferred that little bit softer vane, like even for putting an arrow back in my quiver, and you get a little bit of vane contact between your arrows, and just, that one just kind of folds and slides by and off you go, versus that harder flick,
Yeah. And the Max Stealth, out of everything we shot, I mean, it 100% tested at the top. And listen, we don't make any money on vanes, so this is a very non-biased
right
opinion. I mean, this is we have nothing to gain by saying this one or that. I mean, if there was a better vane out there, we'd use it. I mean, that's not where our business is based on.
Yeah. I've got at least one more arrow question, and then I kind of want to get your take on your broadhead philosophy. I know you guys do broadheads as well, but so you guys have your XD and your HD arrows. What's the differences between those, and a little bit of the why behind, a person might want to go this direction, or they might want to go, the other?
Sure. So the XD arrow was our first arrow, and it is a 4mm micro diameter, thick wall. It's what I deem as here's the deal. Day 6 is basically a function of building what I want to be my dream setup over doing this for 35 plus years. And we're building extra for others to buy. That's basically the mission statement. Okay. This is what I want, and we're building extra for others to buy. The HD is a 4mm micro diameter arrow that I deem and have dreamed about having my entire life. And I deem that as the ultimate hunting arrow, with the components and the arrow, the whole thing, the sum of all parts. To me, that's the ticket. That's the arrow I'll shoot till they bury me. The XD is my first foray into being a outdoor industry hypocrite. So it is a 5mm arrow, which is slightly larger diameter. It's thinner walled. It's lighter grains per inch, but it still does have our centric component system on it. And we also added a alloy knot bushing at the end, because as you get into the larger diameter arrows with less material, that's where they tend to fail, as at the front and the back. They splinter. So we beefed up both ends. But that arrow, the XD, is a response to what a large portion of our customers that bought broadheads from us wanted, because they deem our XD arrows to be too heavy. And so it was hard for us to have really good customers that we'd formed incredible relationships with ask us repeatedly, if you just built a 5mm arrow that A, was lighter, flatter, that's what I want, or B, I can put more weight in the front and have more FOC. These are the people that ignore what I say about FOC. And then C, wanted to shoot a lighted knock, because there's more lighted knock options for a 5mm arrow than there is a 4. And so those were the three things that kept us out of having these customers that would have everything from day 6. And listen, when it comes to 5mm arrows, there's probably not another one out there that's even close to what we provide as far as how we built that shaft after a year of extensive testing and research.
Can you put your white lab coat on too when you say that?
That's exactly right. Yeah, I should get one of those. So, but what we wanted was something a little different, but we wanted to have an all-encompassing package like we did with the first offering, which is to have that 5mm shaft built as durable as we could build it, and then support it and beef it up with an included component system front and back. It's just not available. You have to go buy a 5mm arrow, and then you go buy brand X's third-party components to beef it up. So we just wanted to provide that all in one package. Now, let me say this. Like Dakota, our GM, he shot 3 animals with them this year, killed an elk with them. No problems. I mean, he's happy as a clam. All of the customers that have shot them this year love them. They rave about them. I'm an old guy. I'm set in my ways. It's hard for me to change when I know in my mind something is the best for what I do. But I've tried to be more open-minded as I've done this, with a lot of prodding from my family, like, hey, not everybody's going to do exactly what you like. You have to provide things for people that want to support you. So that's what our XD is. And I feel like it's the best 5mm system out there. And I'll be totally transparent and honest with you. This year to date, we've already sold more XDs than we have our HDs, which, just gets me just in all kinds of turmoil in my mind. But that it's definitely our most popular arrow already, and it's only been out, less than a year. So goes to show you what I know. I may have just discredited this whole podcast.
With that, we talked a little bit earlier about arrow diameter,
Yep.
and I guess, friction as it's passing through the animal. What about wind deflection between a 4 and 5mm arrow? Is that notable in any way?
The smaller the diameter, the best wind drag and less wind drag and wind drift it's going to have. That's just common sense. And you combine a small diameter arrow with a substantial amount of mass compared to a lighter shaft, it's going to be less susceptible to wind drift. And that kind of maybe kind of segues or circles us back to like the FOC thing. I shot high FOC for years because I shot a stick bow, and there's benefits to it there, but I don't even want to get into the weeds with all that. But
right.
But anyway, but what you experience with a high FOC arrow and wind crosswinds, let's talk about crosswinds, is that the point will tend to hit where you're aiming, but the knock and the fletchings will be downwind at an angle. Okay.
Oh, okay.
And so, and people are like, oh, well, that's great. The point's still hitting where you're aiming. Well, it's not really great because your arrow is hitting at an angle, and now your knock is not behind the head, and you're not focusing that energy through. There you go. So for me, a more balanced, heavier arrow that is going to, let's say, drift one way or another downwind, it's going to drift, but it's going to drift perpendicular to the wind and still stay parallel to the target.
Yep.
Does that make sense?
Mm-hmm.
Okay. So, or parallel to its flight. So that's more important to me. I would rather have the arrow drift downwind an inch, but have the whole arrow still in plane versus having the head hit and the tail end be down an inch. That's my philosophy on it. So now, with that said, I'm going to do a very simple analogy that's going to probably make sense to a lot of guys here. Okay. So every day we talk to customers that say, I don't really need the heavy arrow and the fancy cut on contact broadhead. All I shoot is whitetails. Hear it every single day. Well, I'm not elk hunting. I don't need all that. Here's what I'll tell you. In my mind, growing up in the South, shooting a lot of whitetails and a lot of hogs, but mostly shooting a lot of whitetails. What I learned over those years is that it's probably more important on whitetails than it is on elk, and the reason heavy arrow flying true. And the reason is that you're never going to hit a whitetail. Very rarely are you going to hit a whitetail that is not in movement by the time the arrow gets there, and they're in a large state of movement. And so, I grew up boxing, and one of the things that you learn very quickly is keep your eyes open. And the reason you keep your eyes open is you want to see a punch coming so you can feign, duck, and deflect. Okay. And what you're doing is you're moving your body with the punch to reduce the impact. When I used to close my eyes and you didn't see one coming and you get hit flush without seeing it coming, it's over. You're done. You get full impact and you're out. It's the same thing with a whitetail and an arrow. You're never going to hit a deer. Well, let me say not never, but very rarely are you going to hit a deer that's just standing there and it's going to take the full brunt of your arrow. That deer, traditionally, historically, is going to drop and swing its head towards its tail. That's what whitetails do. In contrast to like any pig species will actually lunge forward, regardless of where they are on the planet. Most antelope species, regardless of where they are on the planet, lunge forward. Mule deer are kind of a half and half, but they're kind of forward lunging animals too. Elk are more like deer. They'll do a lot of dropping and spinning. So once you learn these different species and know, you kind of know where to aim. But with a whitetail, as soon as that broadhead enters the hide, it's entering the hide into a target that is in movement. So that target is dropping and spinning away, just like a boxer ducking or feigning a shot. Does that make sense?
Mm-hmm.
And it's basically pulling the head out of the path that the arrow has been taking the whole way there. So what you're doing now is you're basically taking a perfectly tuned arrow, and as soon as it hits and the deer pulls it out of the way, it's now an untuned arrow because doesn't have the knock focused behind the head, and it's not focusing the energy through. Simple terms, 500 grain arrow. You hit a deer, it's in movement, pulls the head out of the way. Now your momentum calculation may be reduced to a 250 grain arrow because it's not all focused anymore. So you still have the benefit of a 250 grain arrow on a moving animal. If you have a 400 grain arrow, and you hit and it's moving. Now you've been reduced to 200. So what you're trying to do when you're figuring arrow weight and the perfect balance is for whitetails, you're wanting to maintain as much mass all the way through that arrow as that deer is pulling the head out of the way and reducing your momentum. Does that make sense?
It does, yeah. I mean, you're almost like, for lack of a better term, like hedging your bets a little bit, like knowing
you're
that
stacking your odds.
You're going to, because of the way that animal will likely react, you're, you know, I guess, again, lack of a better term, like you just got more gas there.
Yeah. Well, like, so when I'm hunting whitetails, and it is location specific to the degrees I do this, but I shoot whitetails with a bow almost the way I grew up wing shooting. I'm almost shooting where they're going to be. So like for a whitetail, depending on where I am in the country, if I'm in the South, I'm basically almost middle, front to back. And I'm basically holding down on the belly because I know that when the arrow gets there, depending on the range is kind of the degree or where I'll hold. But I know that that deer is going to be dropping, number one, but number two, spinning that head towards his tail. And what I see, you know, what I've seen in my lifetime tracking hundreds of whitetails, archery shot whitetails a year in the South, because basically we could kill 2 deer a day for 120 days. So you get a lot of action. I also had a Bavarian mountain hound, a blood tracking dog, for about 13 years and got to see a lot of results there that you wouldn't normally see. But what I saw more than anything is a high forward shoulder shot. That's where people hit and lose animals. High forward or just high.
I've left a few out there under that description.
Yeah. So, but it's hard for people to aim aim on a point on an animal that is not in vitals.
Right.
It's almost impossible to get anyone to do.
It's like, why would I intentionally? I mean, you're not trying to make a bad shot, but it feels like you're intentionally trying to make a bad shot.
It does, but the way I shoot whitetails, like in the South, it's like I'm leading them with a shotgun. It's like a wing shooting style. And then as you get closer to the Midwest, they get a little bit more tolerant of noise, and they don't react as violently, but they do react. So you wouldn't hold it such an extreme. In 2016, I had a couple of say hunting industry influencers come down to our camp in Alabama and hunt. And these guys are great bow hunters. And it took 2 days for them to ever start hitting the whitetails. They were shooting over every one of them. And until I just forced them to aim, on the belly in the middle, they were not going to kill them. And it was so difficult for those guys to hold in a place that they knew if the deer didn't move, it was not a fatal shot. So, but here's what I would say. What I would say is that when guys are looking at like a 3D target, most of their practice is on some type of 3D. And so when they translate that to the field into shooting animals, they're shooting for that 10 ring every time. But the problem is that situational and angle, variables, that 10 ring's never the point. It's not always the point to aim. And like for me, I'm always imagining where the arrow is going to come out, not where it's going to go in. And that's where my point of aim is. And then I'm also anticipating, depending on the species, either a forward lunging animal or a, ducking, spinning its head towards the tail animal. And so I'm holding accordingly. So if you don't want to hold off of vitals, I understand. But what you should do, or what I would recommend doing, is shading that shot towards certain parts of the vitals, holding back and low on a whitetail, holding low and forward on a hog, antelope, things like that. On antelope, I shoot straight up their front leg, always, because they're going forward. So if you shade to the sides of the vitals based on that, you're going to have a higher rate of success. Back to your arrow question, if you have a little bit higher mass and perfect arrow flight, what you've done is you've built in you've built in that contingency with a heavier mass and better flight. So when you hit that moving animal, you don't lose all that momentum value that you would if you hadn't, factored that in with a heavier arrow and perfect flight. Did I confuse the crap out of you with that?
No, man. Amazingly enough, and frankly, Bryan, I'm surprised myself. I'm tracking. I think I'm tracking like one of your arrows. It all makes so much sense.
Well, yeah, it does. It's not what you hear kind of like in the modus operandi of all the information that comes out of the industry. It's almost impossible to listen to somebody else and become a great bow hunter. You got to get out there and skin your knees yourself, and learn from those lessons. But the problem is that people go afield, they learn a very hard lesson, but they don't apply it. They don't apply that information and make a change. They continue to listen to a talking head that says you need to do it this way. The way you're going to become a killer with a bow is screwing up, documenting what's happened, learning from it, and making adjustments based on your experience, not what somebody else is telling you, including myself. Yep. Figure it out on your own. It's going to be a lot better long-term results, I think.
For sure. No, I mean you're right. There is no substitute, and some of those lessons though, they can be pretty hard lessons. I've had
they're painful.
I've had a few myself, guaranteed. We've talked about a lot of parts of the arrow, Bryan, and what about the business end? What do you like? You guys have your own broadheads. Why do you have that broadhead? What do you like about that broadhead? What do you want it to do, and how do you want it to perform?
Sure. Well, this is a lot simpler. A broadhead is a pretty simple tool. It's been around for thousands of years. I mean, we're not reinventing the wheel. Basically, a broadhead kills by hemorrhage. And for it to get maximum hemorrhage, it needs to be razor sharp. So sharpness is so important. And the material that you build that broadhead out of is what's going to determine how sharp you can get it, and then how sharp it will stay as it's passing through the different media or materials of an animal. So that's incredibly important. The shape is incredibly important. We use the convex shape because over the years, long before the modern bow, that shape was determined to be the least amount of resistance when it comes to drag and penetration, but also the most durable as far as staying intact. Look at every arrowhead you find. It's shaped just like our heads are. So I shot two blades for years. I shot double bevels and single bevels. I shot single bevels in the 80s, early 90s. They've been around forever. Now there's been this reemergence of the single bevel craze. It's already, at the end of the day, it's just another one of these kind of fad things that'll come and go. There's nothing wrong with a single bevel head. There's just no benefit to it over a double bevel edge. There's a reason that you don't find any knives with single bevels on them. The reason is because it's an inferior edge. It's an unsupported edge, and it doesn't hold its sharpness as long. What the industry has basically resurrected again for the third or fourth time is that by a single bevel having opposing edges, it creates rotation. Maybe it does, but again, it's one of these things that is not measurable. It may create 1%, 2% more, whatever, rotation, but it really doesn't. So you say, well, what is the benefit of that? Well, you hear the theory is that when it hits bone and turns, it splits the bone. That's not how you split things. Anybody that's ever split wood, you split it with a very sharp wedge, and that's what splits bone, okay? The rotating makes no difference. If it did, in fact, create rotation, which it doesn't, it would not be an advantage, because anyone that's ever driven a nail through a piece of wood versus screwing a screw in knows how little resistance a nail has versus how much torque and energy it takes to turn a screw through. Same exact size fastener, way too much energy needed to push that through. So when you if you tried to screw something through an animal, the head does not have an engine. It can't create rotation. So it has to borrow the energy or tax the energy from the moving arrow. Common sense. So now you're taking your momentum of your arrow, taxing it of all its valuable momentum, and giving some of it to a head so it can rotate. Good thing is, newsflash, they don't rotate, so nothing to worry about there. Listen, it's just common sense. The ratio of the bevel to the head is 2 to 3% bevel, 95, 97%, whatever, body of the head. If that small percentage of bevel or blades, if you will, created rotation, airplanes would be 20% wing and 80% fuselage. You see what I'm saying?
Mm-hmm.
Boat propellers would be 80% hub, 20% blade, but it's not. You need a very substantial ratio of blade to body to actually create rotation. It's common sense. Those things, there's not enough surface area there to move that. Enough to measure. Let's just say that. All right. So that's kind of out the window. So the only disadvantage to a single bevel head is the inferior edge. It's not going to stay as sharp as long. To me, that's way more important. Now, is there anything wrong with a single bevel? Is it not going to work because of that? Absolutely not. We're splitting hairs. It's still a 2-blade. But for me, I shot so many animals with a 2-blade head, probably because of shooting a stick bow for so long. The 2-blade cut on contact head has the least amount of resistance and drag. Okay. So it takes the least amount of force to penetrate. And has the lowest amount of drag, sidewall friction. We talked about that. So, but the problem with it is, the downside is that it leaves a perfect slit wound channel. And that perfect slit very quickly can coagulate and heal back up. And now you've got a wound that's not wanting to leave blood. So by taking what I feel is the perfect design of a 2-blade and adding a bleeder, but properly adding a bleeder, it does two things. Number one, it disrupts that perfect slit and creates a cross now. And it's going to take a lot longer for that wound to heal up. If it's razor sharp, it's going to continue to open. The second thing that properly designed and placed bleeder does is that it also opens up a little bit bigger hole with that cross, and it reduces sidewall friction for the arrow passing behind it and coming through.
Gotcha.
Makes a lot of sense. Super simple stuff. But when I say properly designed,
it's so weird to think about though, Bryan, or maybe like this like popped into my head, but like, you know, if you buy a fountain drink and you have to put your straw into the lid of the fountain drink, it is a little cross that you do that through. A little slit cross that you do that through.
And if it was just a perfect slit, it would be very tough.
Yeah.
Yeah. So very good analogy there for sure. It's a very good visual. When I say properly placed, properly designed bleeder, what you see when people put bleeders on heads, they put them on as an afterthought. So they've spent all this time designing and developing their 2-blade head, and they get the perfect blade angles to have very low resistance, low drag. So the blade is slicing, not chopping, and creating low drag. And then they go, okay, well, we got to put a bleeder on it. So they'll slap a bleeder on and it sticks straight out. Mm-hmm. It does not follow the theory behind keeping the low drag, low resistance blade angle. It's the complete opposite. So you've designed this beautiful head, and then you put an anchor on the back and stick a bleeder straight out with this harsh edge. And that's what creates drag. It also dulls faster. Mm-hmm. If you take a knife and you just put the blade on your finger and just have the weight of the knife and you draw that knife straight back, that slicing will slice right to your bone. But if you take that same knife and have to push down, think about how hard you have to push to get it to cut all the way through. It's a knife versus an axe. Mm-hmm. The other thing is that with blade angle, as that blade is engaging at such a harsh angle, it's dulling very fast to where if it's slicing, it maintains its edge throughout the whole thing. So that's where, like, I didn't really want to get into the broadhead business, but they're just, our broadheads are so simple, but nobody was building that simple design and that simple shape out of the materials that I wanted. And the reason is a few. Number one, the reason ours are convex, or angled out, or radiused out, is because of the strength. Number one, and as the ratio changes as it goes around, it provides very little drag and resistance, and it slices the whole way through. It is the single most efficient blade design you can get. That's why spears look that way. It easily goes in. The reason that you don't see it is it's very expensive to make. Like when it comes to grinding the edge, the people that grind the sharp edges on there for you, when they put those bevels on there, they don't want to have to do a radius head. They just want to do a straight line because they can just sit it right down on a belt and sharpen it. So that was major kickback for us. Is, man, it's just too hard. We've got way too many straight edge things that we can make money on. We're not doing it. So the second thing is the material that we used. The reason that you don't see our material on broadheads is because we use Crucible Industries steel, and Crucible Industries is recognized as the king of knife steels. If you buy a high-end knife, odds are it's a Crucible Industry blade. They make the best knife steels out there for durability, edge retention, sharpness, ease of sharpness, and corrosion resistance. So for me, it was so important to have a true stainless. The only way to get a true stainless that was durable enough to make a good knife edge or a broadhead edge was to go to a high-end knife steel. The reason you don't see anyone else use it is because it's very expensive. It's American-made product from Crucible Industries in upstate New York. And the other reason is that you can't get Crucible Industries steels overseas. So,
oh, gotcha.
You can't do it. So you have to use like just a common tool steel that's available worldwide if you're getting your blades made in Asia or wherever. So that's why you don't see it. That's why ours are pretty unique, but they're also expensive because it's American-made steel. Right, everything's made right here. We actually make all of our components with regards to our aero components, our aluminum, titanium, and stainless, as well as all of our broadhead parts, the ferrules, the screws. We make all of that right here in our shop in Casper, Wyoming. So the reason we make it ourselves, I didn't want to get in the machine business. I promise you, I didn't want to have a machine shop. But the reason we did it was twofold. Number one, we couldn't get anybody to touch titanium because it's hard to machine, and they didn't want to fool with it. So, and then number two, when COVID hit, everything changed. Prices went through the roof. Shipping was impossible. Everything became 10 times harder. And as soon as the very beginning of 2020, when I guess the very beginning of COVID, when all this started happening, as soon as it happened, I said, this is the straw that's going to break the camel's back here. We're going to do this ourselves. We're not going to be reliant on anybody else. So now we can control the materials. We don't have shipping logistics anymore, and we can control the quality. So that's why we brought it in-house and did it ourselves. I'm so glad we did. I will say that the learning curve the first 6 months was a nightmare, but we figured it out, and now we're, I guess 3 years into making everything ourselves.
Very cool.
Yeah. It's fun learning it. But it was a tough road to get where we are. So
it is, but I mean, that's like big, it's nice to be able to insulate yourself from, down the road. You just, obviously nobody has a crystal ball to see the future. So to be able to build that into your guys' business model, I would think has got to feel pretty good.
It is. I mean, what we saw is that when COVID hit, it was kind of commensurate with some of the tariffs and duties that were implemented into some of the Chinese stuff. And so we watched a lot of prices go up because of those associated things. We never did. We never raised ours because we brought it in house and actually reduced costs. So if I was you asked about the business side. If I was a smart businessman, I would have raised our prices along with everyone else because it was accepted. It was 100% accepted. We didn't do it because we were happy with what we were making, still are, as far as our margin. And, this business is a quality of life business, not a quality of bank account. I've already kind of been down that road. So we didn't do it. And the other positive that came out of that for us from a business standpoint, Mark, was that when COVID hit, I don't know if people have noticed, I'm sure they have, but in the last 3 years, aero prices have skyrocketed. And man, I mean, because most of them come from China. So the prices have gone through the roof. And so for us, when we first started, we were kind of deemed expensive. And now, after everything's shaken out, we're middle of the road. We're not the expensive aero anymore, but we actually include more with ours than anybody else. You don't have to throw our components away and go buy something that's like our components. It comes all as one deal. So we're actually cheaper when you look at it that way, but it kind of brought the market to us, which has been great. And we've seen incredible growth through this time because of we got to the point to where guys like, man, I would have bought yours, but you were $40 more. Now I'm going to buy yours because you're $20 less. And so, it's been a kind of a positive for us. And then, I'm sure you don't want to talk about this too much, but we also designed and released a knife this year because it was kind of a natural progression because we were dealing with crucible industry steel and building blades. And I've had this knife design in my head since forever. We released that this year, and man, it's been very well received and just kind of fits right into what we do, which is if there's a hole, we fill it.
No, man. I love it. I mean, so much of what you've said today, and the way that you've explained it, and I've said it a couple times, but it makes a lot of sense to me. Your philosophies and how you think of arrows is not only it actually, there's parallels with how I like my firearm bullets to perform and what I'm looking for performance actually out of a bullet, at the I guess, ultimately at the end of the day, right? But then your arrow philosophy of what you're trying to get out of that and the why behind it and how you're doing it is really in line with my personal goals as well when it comes to hunting. So, no, all very cool stuff, man. I appreciate the time. I appreciate the explanations. Yeah, it like I said, it makes a lot of sense.
We try to keep it simple around here.
And maybe at times, human beings unnecessarily we try to overcomplicate things.
That's right. Well, the ultimate result is always just having a successful hunt and being able to come back with what you're after versus having the one that got away story.
Yep.
And basically our whole business philosophy is just trying to change that ratio from 90% of the guys that have the ones that got away story and 10% successful. We want to close that gap. We don't want the delta to be that big for bow hunters. And so we just try to be a very common sense hunting based company that has that hunting based approach in spite of some of the other noise that you kind of get, wrapped up in from time to time.
Very cool. Very cool. Well, like I said, Bryan, I appreciate the time. Boy, listeners out there, thanks everybody for listening. Man, I sure hope you guys found this as informative as I did. Tons of great information. Bryan, where can they find you? Where can they check your stuff out?
Day 6 Gear. Day6gear.com. That's where we're at.
Very cool. Very cool.
Yeah,
all
man.
right. Thanks everybody. Less stories about the one that got away. Let's tell more stories about the one that didn't get away. Good luck out there bow hunting. Take care. We'll catch you on the next one. Bye.
There you have it, folks. Thank you very much for listening. As usual, give this video a like if you liked it, comment something below, and give us a subscribe to the Vortex Nation podcast channel. It would mean a lot to us. Also, why don't you give us a follow over on Instagram while you're at it, at Vortex Nation Podcast. We'd love to hear from you over there, and we'll keep you updated with all kinds of cool photos and videos from our adventures that we do here. Otherwise, we will see you on the next one. Thank you again. Happy hunting and shooting, everybody. Have a good one.